Let's move from Windows to Linux. Not cool. And if IT is not ready for this, there will also be blind spots. Hello everyone, my name is Alexander Leonov and this is In the Trend of VM. In this episode, I'll cover the top vulnerabilities of November and answer a couple of questions related to VM practices. There were 8 trending vulnerabilities in November, and 3 of them were in Microsoft products. Spoofing in Windows NTLM. The vulnerability is from the November Microsoft Patch Tuesday. It immediately showed signs of being exploited in the wild. The vulnerability is related to the outdated MS-HTML platform, which is still used in Windows. To exploit the vulnerability, the user must minimally interact with the malicious URL file. Right-click on it, delete it, or move it to another folder. There is no need to open the malicious file. As a result, the attacker receives the user's NTLMv2 hash, which he can use for authentication. According to Clear Sky, the vulnerability is used to distribute SparkRat, an open-source remote access Trojan. Elevation of privilege in Windows Task Scheduler. It was released on November Microsoft Patch Tuesday and showed signs of exploitation in the wild right away. To exploit the vulnerability, an authenticated attacker runs a specially crafted application on the target system. The attack can be performed from an app container restricted environment, in which applications are given access only to specifically granted resources. Using this vulnerability, an attacker could escalate privileges to medium integrity level and gain the ability to execute RPC remote procedure call functions that are restricted to privileged accounts only. ESET reports that the vulnerability allowed the Romcom attackers to execute malicious code outside the Firefox sandbox and then launch hidden PowerShell processes to download and run malware from command and control servers. There is a backdoor code on GitHub that exploits this vulnerability. Spoofing in Microsoft Exchange. The vulnerability is from the November Microsoft Patch Tuesday. An incorrectly formulated P2 from header processing policy allows an attacker to make his email address look legitimate to the victim, for example, like a work colleague's address, which of course significantly increases the effectiveness of phishing attacks. The vulnerabilities affect Exchange Server 2019 and Exchange Server 2016. Microsoft has paused the rollout of the initial patches published on November 12th. Their installation led to crashes. New fixes were published by Microsoft only on November 27. Install November Microsoft security updates. Let's move from Windows to Linux, or more precisely to Ubuntu. On November 19, Qualys released a security bulletin about 5 privilege escalation vulnerabilities in the Need Restart utility used in Ubuntu Server, starting with version 21.04. The Need Restart utility runs automatically after apt operations installing, updating, or removing packages. It checks if a reboot is required, thus ensuring that services use updated libraries without unnecessary downtime. All 5 vulnerabilities make it possible for a regular user to become root superuser with maximum privileges. Qualys has private exploits for each. There is currently a publicly available exploit only for one vulnerability related to the Python path environment variable. It is available on GitHub since November 20th. Update Need Restart to version 3.8 or disable interpreter scanning in needrestart.conf. In conclusion, I will tell you about 4 more vulnerabilities in network devices. Remote code execution in FortiManager, FortiJump. FortiManager is a centralized solution for configuring, enforcing policies, updating, and monitoring Fortinet network devices. The vulnerability was released on October 23. The FortiManager FGFMD FortiGate to FortiManager daemon has a missing authentication mechanism for a critical function. This vulnerability enables remote attackers to execute arbitrary code or commands by sending specially crafted requests. There were signs of exploitation in the wild, and the vulnerability was added to the CISA-KEV. On November 15th, Watchtower Labs published a post about this FortiJump vulnerability with a video demo and a link to the POC. The researchers noted that the IOCs in the Fortinet bulletin can be bypassed, and the patch itself is incomplete. It is possible to escalate privileges on a patched device by exploiting a vulnerability called FortiJumpHigher. Install security updates. Authentication bypass in PAN-OS web interface. An unauthenticated attacker with network access to the Palo Alto device web management interface could gain PAN-OS administrator privileges to perform administrative actions, tamper with the configuration, or exploit other authenticated vulnerabilities. Firewalls of the PA-VM-CN series and the Panorama management platform are vulnerable. The vendor recommends restricting access to the management web interface to trusted internal IP addresses only. On November 8th, a Palo Alto bulletin was released. On November 15th, signs of attacks were noticed, labeled as Operation Lunar Peak. On November 18th, the vulnerability was added to the CISA-KEV. On November 19th, Watchtower Labs released a post with technical details. Supply the auth value to the XPAN authcheck HTTP request header, and the server helpfully turns off authentication, and exploits soon appeared on GitHub. Elevation of privilege in PAN-OS. An attacker with PAN-OS administrator access to the management web interface can perform actions on the Palo Alto device with root privileges. Linux commands can be injected via unvalidated input in create remote app web session.php script. The need for authentication and admin access could limit this vulnerability's impact. But here we have the previous vulnerability, authentication bypass in PAN-OS. Exploitation of this vulnerability chain was noted by Palo Alto on November 17th. After November 19th, when the Watchtower Labs article was published and exploits appeared, mass attacks began. On November 21st, Shadow Server reported that approximately 2,000 hosts were compromised, mostly in the US and India. According to Wiz, attackers deployed web shells, sliver implants, and crypto miners. To fix vulnerabilities in PAN-OS, install security updates released by Palo Alto. Path traversal in Zixel firewall. A directory traversal vulnerability in the web management interface of Zixel firewall could allow an attacker to download or upload files via a crafted URL. The vulnerability affects Zixel ZLD firmware versions from 5 to 5.38. Used in the following series of devices. Specialists from Sequoia discovered this vulnerability being exploited on their honeypots by ransomware attackers from the Helldown group. There are no public exploits yet, Zixel recommends. Update firmware to version 5.39, which was released on September 3rd. Disable remote access until devices are updated. And learn best practices for device configuration. If your company uses Zixel firewalls, please pay attention. Is it possible to manage vulnerabilities with no budget? Well, basically yes. Most of the work in the vulnerability management process does not require purchasing any solutions. You won't need them to detect and describe assets. And also to discuss SLA for vulnerability remediation and preferably regular patching with asset owners. And it's not that difficult to automate the creation of remediation tasks and tracking their statuses. The main problem is vulnerability detection. It is difficult to imagine an organization's infrastructure for which the capabilities of free utilities will be enough, unless only Linux hosts are used there and software is installed only from the official repository. Then OpenSCAP with OVAL content from your Linux vendor will be enough. When using commercial VM solutions, there will also be blind spots, unsupported software or hardware installations. But if you use only free utilities, it will be one big blind spot. In theory, everything is possible, especially if a VM specialist has 48 hours in a day and has no other tasks. But in practice, it is much easier and more efficient to use commercial VM solutions. Should a VM specialist specify a patch to install on the host in a vulnerability remediation task? Here's what I think. If there is a simple way to give such information to IT, then you need to do it. For example, if a vulnerability scanner gives such recommendations, if it requires intensive research, then you shouldn't do it. Otherwise, it will be yet another game of prove and show. And instead of building a VM process to improve the security of the entire organization, you will be investigating which vulnerability is fixed by which KB. Not cool. Detecting a vulnerability on a host is a sign that the IT department is not doing its job correctly. Ideally, everything should be fixed in the process of unconditional regular patching, and vulnerability scans should only confirm that everything is okay. If IT can't implement such a process, then let them deal with fixing specific vulnerabilities and finding patches. That's all. Read more about these vulnerabilities in our November digest of trending vulnerabilities and in the post on Haber. Links in the QR code and in the description. Alexander Leonov was with you. Share your thoughts about this episode in the comments. We are also waiting for your questions on the topic of vulnerability management. I will answer the best questions in the next episodes of In the Trend of VM and give prizes for them. See you in a month. Bye, everyone. 16, 16. A phrase from Gazmanov's song. We've already joked about this.